Hey guys, welcome to a Tiny Fibre Studio project diary. This is the Wool and Honey sweater by Andrea Mowry that I am knitting right now, and as I thought I'm kind of getting a little bit bored of garter stitch, I thought now might be a good time to give you a little bit of a recap on this project. Usually in my project diaries I will be going right the way from scratch, so I'll be going right from the planning stage onwards. But in this case, I'm almost all the way through the project. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of a recap if you haven't seen any of the Tiny Fibre Studio episodes that have dealt with it in the past. For those of you who have seen those episodes, yes, it does feel like this project has been going on forever. I've looked through my photos. Actually, it's not that bad. I think I started swatching for it in January of that last year, but I didn't actually start properly knitting it until quite a lot later in the year because I was having all kinds of gauge issues, which I will get into. So a little bit of detail first on the pattern itself. So it is the Wool and Honey sweater by Andrea Mowry. You no doubt will have seen it around before. It is a top-down hexagon yoked sweater. That's the back. This is how far I've got with it so far. It is designed to be knit in Brooklyn Tweed Loft, which is a fingering weight woolen spun yarn. Could be really quite expensive to make in that yarn if you wanted to do it. You're talking probably about £100 or so. I'll put dollar conversions on the screen, but obviously that is going to vary depending on US to UK conversions. The yardage is 1,390 yards through to 280, depending on which size you're doing. The sizing ranges from an extra small, which is a 39-inch chest, through to a triple XL, which is a 63-inch chest. You might be thinking, why is the smallest size so much bigger than you might expect? It's because there's about 9 inches of positive ease in the sample, and you are advised to give it sort of between 4 and 9 inches of positive ease. The gauge was what gave me difficulties to start with. So I had chosen initially not to do this in Brooklyn Tweed Loft, mostly I think because there wasn't actually a Brooklyn Tweed Loft colour that I particularly liked for it personally. You might have a favourite that you go, oh no, that's amazing. But for me, there wasn't really anything that I particularly liked. And this is a local yarn to me. This is Blackie Yarn's Tamar 4-ply. And I got a sweater quantity of it specifically to do the sweater. The gauge is 26 stitches to 46 rows. And I swatched probably at least 4 times with this yarn, and I could not get gauge. In some cases I was nowhere near, and in others I was kind of vaguely in the right direction, but I could never get both the row gauge and the stitch gauge to be kind of anywhere close to each other or anywhere proportionate to that gauge. And I thought at first, maybe it's just the yarn, maybe I'm just not going to get that gauge with that yarn. So when I went to Edinburgh Yarn Festival last year, I bought some Brooklyn Tweed Loft as per the pattern, and I tried swatching with that as well, and I got exactly the same swatch results. So I went, okay, fine, it's clearly not the Brooklyn Tweed Loft that is the key to this. I'm just going to have to figure out the gauge myself. So it went in the naughty corner for a little bit because I couldn't be bothered to figure out the gauge. My initial instinct was, okay, let me just cast on with the needle that's given me the closest to actual gauge or correct gauge. So I cast on with a 2.75mm needle. Now, let me just say that casting on any sweater, let alone one in the round in garter stitch, in other words, you have to do a lot of purling, on any needle size starting with 2 is not really something that I'm a fan of, but I thought, okay, well, you know, if I want this sweater, that's the one that's given me closest to gauge, let's give it a try. So I cast it on, and what I determined by looking at the photos from the pattern was that if I cast on and knit the first 3 lots of hexagons, then that should, in theory, get me to the shoulder. Like the edge of the shoulder should be on the 3rd lot of hexagons. So I thought, okay, well, you know, let me just knit that. It's probably not going to take very long, and it didn't. It was tiny. It was absolutely minuscule. I could barely get it over my head, and yeah, it was definitely way, way, way too tight. So back in the naughty corner it went. Eventually, when it came back out again, I decided to just cast on with the needle size that's in the pattern, which in this case is for the main fabric 3.5mm, for the ribbing 3.25. So I cast it on with 3.5mm needles, totally fine. So I've continued with 3.5mm needles, and the first time round, I knit all of the yoke, and then I was trying to think about where I was going to split for the sleeves, because what happens in the original pattern is you do a lot of increasing, and you don't split for the sleeves until you're quite a long way down the yoke, and I didn't really want that. I wanted the sleeves to start a bit sooner. So I looked at everybody's projects, and thank you to everybody who's left helpful notes on any of their wool and honey projects, because I trawled through those, and the consensus seemed to be that splitting for the sleeves at row 37-ish was the best option if you did want to split for the sleeves earlier. So that was what I did. That worked, however. One of the project pages that I had been following was somebody who said split for the sleeves at row 37, and there was no comment about rearranging the hexagons, and to be honest, I didn't really think about rearranging the hexagons until I split for the sleeves and realised that what was happening was that the hexagons were basically going to disappear in under the armhole, and I didn't want that. The interesting thing was the project page that I'd been specifically looking at, where they'd said split at row 37, they had only photographed the garment from one side, and on that side the hexagons were totally fine. On the other side, not so much. So I wasn't happy with where those hexagons were being placed. So I took photos of it as it was before I started to rip back, made sure that I had good records of how it had ended up looking and where I wanted to put the hexagons for my version. Then I ripped back to the 4th set of hexagons, which is this one, and that's the last one where you've got just continuous hexagons, and then I kind of just did it freeform from there. It's quite easy to do. By the time you get to that stage, you're pretty used to how the hexagons work, how they're constructed and so on, so it's not a big deal to kind of switch around where those hexagons go. Like I say, you just kind of have to have good notes of where you're putting them. So then I re-knitted with my uneven hexagons placement, and I just continued to knit as per the pattern. The one thing that I can't really remember, which is why hopefully future project diaries are going to be useful, is how I chose how many sleeve stitches to have. because the sleeve stitches, basically there weren't enough of them the first time that I knitted the sleeves. And I had already knitted the body. I got to the sleeves and I was like, it seems a little bit tight, but I was ignoring the voice in my head, which was a huge mistake because I'd knitted the body, I started knitting the sleeves, I got down to the bottom of one of the sleeves and went, this is too tight. I was round at Katie's and I was like, is this looking a little bit too tight to you? And she was like, yeah. She was just affirming what I already had in my head. So I came home, ripped out the sleeves and the body, again having taken copious notes and photos, and it went back in the naughty corner again. I've lost track now. I think that's like the 4th time in the naughty corner. So it wasn't an issue because of the amount of ease in the body. There are plenty of stitches to play with. So I just stole 6 stitches from the body, put those on the sleeves, and that's where I'm at the moment. The sleeves are still a little bit slim fitting, we'll call it, but they're okay. And the body is still has a lot of ease in it. But again, I'm okay with that, and I think it just kind of lends itself to the original style of the pattern. So yeah, I'm down with that. I'm good. We can live with that. So there we go. That is a little recap of where we've got to so far, and I will update you as I get further through it. One of the other things that comes up quite a lot when you look at the project notes that people have written on their wool and honey sweaters is quite a few different ideas of ways to get rid of the jog that happens down the back of the sweater. This is where you're switching from knit stitches to purl stitches, and it creates this little jog or seam down the back. There are various different ways to manage that. So some people have used helical knitting, other people have used a technique for doing garter stitch in the round where you don't need to purl. That's quite an interesting technique. The way that that works is you knit one round as normal, and then essentially you knit the second round inside out. Both of those are quite interesting techniques. I chose not to do that because in the yoke pattern, where you're making the hexagons, you have elements of that happen on both knit rows and purl rows, and so I didn't really want to be trying to manage that whilst trying to also not have a jog. If I'd waited until I'd finished all of the hexagons, I would have been most of the way through the sweater anyway, and it would have looked weirder if I had suddenly got to the end of the hexagons and then didn't have a jog for the rest of it. So I just decided to suck it up and have a seam line down the back of it. The only bit that is slightly irritating to me is this little bit where it's been coming down fairly straight from the top of the yoke, and then when it hits this hexagon, it just kind of skews off a little bit. But to be honest, it's on my back, so I've decided that I don't mind that much. But if you are super perfectionist, as I usually am, it might just be something that you want to take account of. If you want to find out more about ways to manage that jog and to get rid of it, it's worth going on to the Ravelry projects for the wool and honey sweater and doing a search for the word jog, and you will find lots of posts that talk about ways to manage that. So it is done. Thank goodness for that, because that took a year. Not the fault of the pattern. If I had just knit it according to the pattern, it would have been absolutely fine and it would have been done ages ago. But I made quite a lot of modifications, and so hence why it took a long time. There are a couple of other little notes that I want to put in this project diary. One is, originally I had done waist shaping, which I was happy with until I had completely finished it. And I tried it on and I had these hip bumps that were completely unnecessary, and that was where I'd done the waist shaping, so I'd put some increases at the top here, I'd, you know, knitted straight until I got down to roughly about there, and then I'd done some increases to go back out for the hips. Because there's such a lot of ease in here anyway, I don't need it. But also that was having the effect that by the time you got down to the ribbing and the ribbing was pulling it back in again, it was almost more like a sort of really pronounced hourglass, and then kind of tapered down at the bottom as well. Not a good look. Don't need these weird little hip bumps. And they were over quite a small space as well, so it just looked really odd. So ripped that back. Took out the increases, so I didn't bother with any hip increases at all, and just knitted it straight down from there. I said in an earlier clip that I felt like the sleeves were a little bit tight. Actually, I think they're okay. They're perfectly fine. Not an issue. So yeah, there it is. Finished wool and honey sweater. You can see where I changed the hexagons. So the hexagons are no longer symmetrical, which I quite like. I think it just makes it a little bit more interesting, and none of the hexagons disappear into the armpit either. So there we go, Andrea Mowry's wool and honey sweater ticked off the list. It will be a while before I do any large project in garter stitch again, because that was a little bit annoying and took for freaking ever. I think to finish the sleeve, I was down to about here, maybe a little bit further. It took me 11.5 hours of pretty much straight knitting to get down to here. That's a long time. So yeah, I will be taking a break from garter stitch for a while. But things that I love about this sweater, one, it is really, really warm, and I am quite a cold-blooded person, so the garter stitch really does make it really nice and warm. I also am a really big fan of the hexagons. Loving that. I'm actually starting work on another hexagon themed project at the moment. I actually like having a sweater that has a little bit more ease. That's quite interesting. Normally I go for sweaters that kind of pull in and are fairly form-fitting, but I actually quite like this little bit of extra ease. So yeah, all in all, very long project the way that I did it. Lots of frogging and re-knitting, but actually lots of things learned in the process. And yeah, thumbs up for the wool and honey sweater. So I hope this video was useful for you. Do let me know if you have knit it yourself or if you're inspired to knit it. And I will see you again in another video. Another project diary will be on the way soon. If you want to find me in between now and the next video, you can find me on Instagram as Tiny Fibre Studio, and on Ravelry I'm Ibex. If you enjoyed this video, please do leave a like, comment and subscribe if you haven't already, because it really does help the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in another video.